Son of Escobar, Firstborn. Written by Roberto Sendoya Escobar. Narrated by Will Huggins. Prologue. I had two fathers. The one I called Dad, and loved dearly, was my adoptive father, Patrick Whitcomb. I knew him as an English businessman who had made a successful life for his family in Colombia. That was only half the story. It wasn't until years later that I found out he was also an MI6 agent, working undercover for British intelligence. But hearing that still wasn't my biggest shock. I learned that my biological father was Pablo Escobar, the most notorious gangster in the history of the world. I had met him only fleetingly, unaware of our connection, or that there were times he was prepared to kill to win me back. This is the story of how the lives of my two fathers became inextricably intertwined. Good and evil, light and darkness, this story has it all. When I was a child, I knew nothing of all this. I just thought Patrick, Pat to everyone who knew him, was a regular dad. There were an awful lot of guns and strangeness going on around our beautiful mansion in Colombia, but my dad worked for a firm that printed banknotes for governments and ran an armored car business, and as an employee he was subject to attack from criminal gangs. It was just part of our life. Although sometimes it felt like violence followed us around, and I was grateful for my round-the-clock armed protection. There were also a few occasions on which my father took me to a place called Medellin, where I met a younger man who took a keen interest in me. This was Escobar. And there was the day I saw huge bags of money being loaded onto a plane. Little did I know of the murky dealings that linked these two powerful figures in Colombia's turbulent history, and the millions of dollars that passed between them. Only when I was 24 did my father, Pat, sit me down and tell me the true story of my extraordinary life. It was 1989, and by then I had left home and was living in Sotogrande on the Costa del Sol of Spain, near Gibraltar. Until that day I had always been Philip Whitcomb, although I did know that I was adopted. It hadn't worried me. I always looked upon Pat and his wife Joan as my dad and mum. They had told me I had been born in Colombia, which explained my darker hair and features. But until this point, both had said that nothing was known about my real parents, and I had always accepted it. Now Pat prepared to turn my world upside down. "What we told you wasn't the whole story," Dad said. "It's time you knew the whole truth." He revealed I had started life as Roberto Sendoya Escobar. They had adopted me from a Catholic orphanage. My mother was dead and they believed my father had given up any claim for me. It was then that he explained how he had come to cross paths with Pablo Escobar. Dad had been tasked with setting up the Colombian arm of the banknote printing company De La Rue, and, as part of his work, he needed to infiltrate the criminal gangs then gaining a foothold in the country's fledgling economy and pass back intelligence. Some of this information made its way back to the UK Secret Services, but the main beneficiaries for the elaborate, sophisticated and devastatingly effective operation were their US counterparts in the CIA. Dad explained that the armored car division often came under attack, and their consignments of newly printed Colombian banknotes would be stolen. After one such robbery, Dad received intelligence to the whereabouts of the missing money. With the backing of his bosses in London and his employers in UK intelligence, he mounted a daring and heavily armoured mission to recover the cash. It was in the course of this most bloody of expeditions that I was discovered as a helpless baby in the gang's hideout, and the link with my biological father, Escobar, was established. At the time, Pablo Escobar was a teenager and nothing more than a low-level criminal. But as he rose through the criminal ranks, he would go on to be a useful asset for the intelligence services, who sought to influence the growing gang networks in Colombia. It was the early 1960s and the cocaine trade was in its infancy. There was no way of predicting the way that its cultivation and supply would become one of the biggest industries in the world, or of knowing that the secret services would play a key role in allowing the gangs to flourish, creating the cocaine cartels that brought so much misery to so many people. At the time, Pat's goal was simply to safeguard his company's interests and provide intelligence for the services back home. Enter one more figure who would much later become notorious on the world stage. An ambitious Panamanian, then just an officer, named Manuel Noriega, not only assisted Dad on the fateful mission that led him to Escobar, but would also go on to help him in his dealings with the criminal gangs. Noriega and Escobar were quite the pair, between them overseeing the rise of narcotic trafficking to a global level. What had begun as a low-level operation in aid of securely transporting government-issued banknotes exploded into a dangerous game, trying in vain to control drug gangs that nobody could have known would become so big that their resources started to outstrip those of many entire nations. Yet for years, U.S. intelligence's attitude to the amount of cocaine flooding the U.S. verged on the relaxed. It was only when the amount of dollars for drugs pouring out of the USA, then the largest economy in the world, reached dangerously high levels, that action was at last taken. The once primitive criminal gangs had by then morphed into huge drug cartels that made more money than they knew how to spend. By the time that I began to find out the truth of my life, Escobar was fearing his grip on power was slipping and had hidden millions of dollars in secret locations. When Dad told me all of this and hinted that he knew where some of the money was, it was at first too much to take in. It was only slowly that this incredible story began to make sense to me. For years I had been plagued by vague dreams of what I thought were explosions and a woman's screams. Were these somehow related to real events, to that armed mission that Dad had mounted, and that led to my rescue? I remembered our trips to Medellin. Suddenly, conversations I'd had with a mysterious man with a magnetic presence took on a new significance. Was this Escobar, my biological father? Over the course of a number of conversations, I listened intently as Dad slowly revealed hidden details about my life. One part of the story was particularly hard for him to recount, the aspect I was most desperate to hear. How had he known my biological mother was dead? In explaining my birth mother's death, Dad shook me to my core, forcing me to question everything I'd ever thought I knew about myself, my legal guardians, and the people who brought me into this world. That wasn't all. Many years later, as he lay dying, my father imparted perhaps his most sensational secret: clues to the location of Escobar's legendary missing millions. What follows is based on the information given by my adoptive father, Pat, and blended with my own extensive research. This is at last the true story of my life. All the events are factual, although I have, inevitably, had to dramatize scenes and conversations as I believe they would have happened. The story begins on the day that I was discovered by Pat. It was an accidental rescue that set the fates of Patrick Whitcomb and Pablo Escobar on a collision course, bonding us together forever. Son of Escobar by Roberto Sendoya Escobar. Narrated by Will Huggins. Chapter 1. The Secret Mission. For Satatavia, Colombia, late October 1965. The two helicopters appeared with the rising sun. Each spanking new US Bell UH-1 Huey was armed with two M134 miniguns, capable of preset firing rates of 2,000 RPM, each linked to 4,000 rounds of ammunition. They were also equipped with two M75 40mm grenade rocket launchers, both fed from a 300-round magazine. Aboard each was 6 newly trained Colombian Special Forces personnel. Sitting in the front passenger seat of the leading chopper was the man in charge, Pat Whitcomb. A tall, powerful-looking Englishman looked as incongruous as the two aircraft flying low over an otherwise peaceful countryside. They were 3,000 meters above sea level, yet only 500 meters above the ground. Pat could scarcely believe he was leading this mission. Before he joined De La Rue, a respectable banknote printer and security company established in London in the 19th century, he had barely set foot in a helicopter. Since then, the operations with which he had been tasked had grown increasingly dangerous. Almost all of his training had been on the job itself. He had swiftly discovered that Colombia was a violent country. Recently, one of his armored cars had been blown up, killing 2 security guards and injuring others. This was one of the worst incidents to affect De La Rue, which had been tasked with securely printing Colombia's currency and transporting it safely around the country. The vehicle had been destroyed in the course of making a delivery, and the incident had major ramifications for the firm. It wasn't just a question of the money that was stolen, although it wasn't an insignificant sum, running into the hundreds of thousands of dollars, but the message it sent out. The various gangs jockeying for power and influence would believe that they could attack De La Rue with impunity, and, by extension, they were hitting the heart of Colombia's economy itself. There had to be a firm response, and once the firm received intelligence about the gang's whereabouts, they were determined to strike back. The pilot, sitting beside Pat, pointed to a cluster of dwellings on the hillside ahead. Pat compared the site before him with the aerial photographs provided. He nodded. They were here. He glanced at the soldiers manning the machine gun and rocket launchers in the doorway and back to the other gunners in the second helicopter. He turned to the men behind, whose excited chatter had been constant since they left the country's capital city, Bogota, and gave a thumbs up. They clocked Pat's signal and, as one, fell silent, clutching their weapons in anticipation. Before they had set off, Pat had thought the setup he was commanding would be a sledgehammer cracking a nut, and as he looked again at the sleepy village ahead, his view was only confirmed. His targets wouldn't know what hit them. "Hawk 2, this is Hawk 1, over," Pat said in clipped tones over the radio. "Hawk 1, Hawk 2, over," came the accented response from his counterpart in the aircraft behind. A stocky man with a heavily pockmarked face. This was Manuel Noriega, then just an officer with the Panamanian military, but even at that point, extremely ambitious. Seconded to the intelligence efforts in Colombia, he had been a useful ally to Pat in the shadowy meeting place where state business and private enterprise shared a common interest. Now Noriega seemed to be relishing joining in on the action. "Hawk 2, we have visual on the target. Prepare to attack. Roger, Hawk 1, out." They dropped to 150 feet, and Pat gestured to a small clearing ahead of the first house. Radioing his intention to Noriega, who he always referred to by his code name, JB, a reference to his favorite whiskey brand, Justerini & Brooks. His eyes fixed on a rundown house with a single small door to the street. Movement in the house next door caught his eye. 2 shabbily dressed men appeared. He could see the terror on their faces as they scurried back inside. The blast from the rotors kicked up a cloud of dust. As the choppers touched down, the soldiers jumped from the side and headed straight for the house. They only got a few yards when the 2 men reappeared in the doorway, this time with assault rifles. But before they had even cocked their weapons, a round of gunfire from the advancing troops floored them. More gunfire followed, as a face at a window was greeted with an avalanche of bullets. "So much for minimal casualties," Pat shouted to JB above the roar of the blades. as they took in the action, standing to the rear and flanked by 2 blue-uniformed close protection officers, or bodyguards. JB shrugged. "I told you, if they want a war, they'll get one." The soldiers split up into groups, some heading to the rear of the target property, others charging through the front door, while other units tackled neighboring buildings. Gunfire resounded. Pat respected his enemy as he looked around. They had chosen an unlikely hideout, yet the response from the gang told him without a doubt that their intelligence had been perfect. It might look like a backwater, unremarkable farmer country, but this was one harvest worth fighting for. JB and Pat advanced up the dirt track towards the building behind the security officers, their light, small-caliber machine guns raised. There was movement from the back of one of the buildings, another burst of rapid-fire gunshot. 2 soldiers emerged with a large black bag. Pat nodded. He recognized one of the missing De La Rue issue containers. Exactly what they had come for. The thieves hadn't even bothered to switch the cash from the firm's own bags. He motioned to the soldiers to put it in the chopper, and instinctively ducked for cover as shots rang out from somewhere behind him. He turned in time to see a group of around 6 men attacking from another building further up the track. No sooner had he spotted the threat than the gangsters were obliterated by fire from one of the helicopters. Pat paused to make sure no more reinforcements were on their way and dusted himself down before continuing his team's advance. This was turning into a bloodbath. They stopped by the doorway into the house. From inside he could hear screams that chilled his blood. A protection officer stepped inside before returning to give him the all-clear. Pat and the others entered to see a man, or what was left of him, sprawled on the ground in a pool of his own blood. Astride him sat one of the Colombian soldiers, with the butt of his gun rammed into a bullet hole in the fallen man's shoulder, screaming in his ear. Pat could see it was obviously far too late for interrogation. He gestured to the soldier to step back. "Muerto," he said. "Dead," drawing a hand across his own throat to underline his words. The soldier composed himself and stood up. Pat needed to know if they had found any more of the stolen money. "El dinero?" he asked. The soldier shrugged, but one of his colleagues had better news. Pat learned that more bags had been recovered, all filled with banknotes. They'd found what they'd been looking for. They'd found a live target to question, and he had given up the location of the rest of the loot and had identified his comrades. Mission accomplished, it seemed. This ragtag bunch of robbers and thugs might think twice before blowing up another of De La Rue's armored cars. A rattle of firing sounded from outside, but then the guns fell silent, and there was an eerie stillness. Only the hum of the rotor blades and the odd shout of "claro" for clear came from outside. Pat wondered, was anyone left alive? JB seemed to read his mind, for he shrugged and motioned to the security men to begin their investigation of the property. Pat paused, to look once more at the corpse at his feet. Although bloodied almost beyond recognition, the man looked young, possibly still a teenager. He shook his head. Just kids. What were they doing getting involved in a man's business? The blast of a single shot from another room gave him a jolt. Another fatal strike, probably. Their soldiers would have to be careful. So far, it seemed as if they'd managed to avoid any casualties. The last thing he wanted was some punk making a heroic last stand after pretending to be dead. He hoped they were taking nothing for granted. A film of dust seemed to cloak the air. The day was not yet warm, but he could feel his collar sticking to his neck, and the moisture had dried from his mouth. He took out a handkerchief and mopped his brow. JB and one of his security team took a room to the right, while Pat moved through the rear of the house, where 2 steps led down to a back room. Gun still raised, the officer checked inside, gasped, and took aim. Pat stepped from behind him and, on seeing his target, instinctively stuck out an arm to lower the weapon. No! There, on the floor by a window, was a woman, eyes wide, panting heavily. She was wearing what he thought at first was a red dress, But as he drew closer, he could see the crimson was not dye. He motioned the officer back, and, ducking his 6'4" frame to enter the doorway, Pat approached her slowly, holding out his hands. As he did so, movement drew his eye to the corner of the room, and to what he now saw was a cot. Sitting inside was a boy, all chubby cheeks and a shock of dark hair, staring back at him. "Good God," he said, kneeling by the woman. Her eyes were full of fear, at which at first he thought was probably directed at him and the harm she felt he might do her. He surveyed her injuries and began to suspect her terror was at the end she knew was coming. "Lo siento," he said softly. "So sorry." "Mijo," she said, her eyes watery, pleading. "My son." "Shh, don't speak. Tranquila," Pat said, suddenly finding himself having to search for the Spanish words that for the last 6 years had been commonplace. He removed his flak jacket and tried to apply it to the source of the bleeding, a puncture wound in her side. She cried out as he gently eased her forward, and it was then he realized that what he'd seen before was merely an exit wound. Shot in the back. Christ. He could only imagine what organs had been seared in the process. He rolled up the flak jacket and used it as a pillow, easing her back down on it. Even if he were able to get her onto the helicopter, she'd be gone before they made it back to Bogota. At least now, her last breaths might be a little more comfortable. She winced, sweat pouring from her brow, merging with the tears streaming from her eyes. She lifted one violently shaking hand. He could feel the effort it took. "Mijo," she kept whispering. He understood. "My boy." He clasped her hand, but to his surprise she shook it free, and then he got it. She was pointing to a small table with a drawer. He looked at it. "El cajón." She nodded. He shuffled over and pulled open the drawer. Inside was a small fabric bag, containing what looked like keepsakes. A ticket of some description, a ribbon, a lock of dark hair, and a much folded piece of paper. As he inspected it, he saw her nod again. He unfolded it, to see it was some form of legal document. "Mijo," she said again. She was looking into the cot, where the little boy still sat smiling. She returned the smile, beaming. But it was too much for her, and she broke down into heavy sobs. Her whole body shaking now, her breathing labored. Through her tears he detected only one word. "Roberto." "Si." He put a finger to his chest. "Patrick." He wasn't sure if she registered. He pushed the bag into her hand and tried to comfort her, but she was fading fast. Her breathing rattled. He held her to try and calm the shaking. It's okay," he said, over and over. But eventually he realized she couldn't hear him. She was somewhere else. He laid the woman down on the floor and smoothed the hem of her dress down. He found a blanket over the cot and took one final look. She could have been sleeping. Only now she was at peace. He could see that she too was just a child, barely a teenager perhaps. He let out a long sigh and gently covered her. What was she doing in a place like this? A sparsely furnished room where the faded green paint was peeling off the walls. What a waste. "Hey, what is happening?" It was JB. He was at the doorway with 2 soldiers. "We should go. We got everything we came for." He looked past the Englishman and clocked the body. "Shame." "I'm coming," Pat said. He looked at the child. What was he to do? This was not part of the plan. None of their intel mentioned the likelihood of collateral damage, and they had not factored in human cargo. Yet he could not leave a child in this place. It would be to condemn him to death. He fished out the paper again. The woman, whoever she was, had wanted him to have this. She had wanted him to do something, the right thing. He saw a name on the paper: Roberto Sendoya Escobar. Escobar. It was a name he recognized from one of the lawyers who had helped his firm set up in Colombia. He remembered what she said. Roberto. So, you're Roberto, he said, addressing the child. The infant smiled back. Pleased to meet you too. He gathered up the child in his arms and wrapped him in his bedding. You're coming with me. Later that day, Pat entered a Catholic orphanage in central Bogota, carrying a bundle in tightly swaddled bedclothes. He asked to see Father Londono, whom he was assured would be expecting him. After a brief discussion, Pat handed the bundle over to the priest, who bowed in recognition of his Christian act. I'll be seeing you, Pat said when it was time to leave. Take good care of him. Eldest especial. In the days that followed, news of the gun battle and the heavily armed birds that dropped from the sky in the early morning sun, bringing mayhem in their wake and the deaths of everyone in what was supposed to be a safe house, spread from village to village. It would not have been long before word reached the ears of a 15-year-old boy, one Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria. Few people would have known that he was connected to a victim of the raid. He lived 350 miles away, in Antioquia, and probably, like everyone else who heard the news, would have been shocked at first by the brutality and retribution for what had, essentially, just been a robbery, albeit one that had resulted in loss of life. When he thought about it, he might even have admired the ruthlessness of the operation. It was the sort of thing that would appeal to him. But then news filtered through about the young woman who died, and the child she left in the house. Escobar had had a brief relationship with her, and knew the boy was his, and that the child had disappeared. How did he feel about that? How did he feel when he found out who had taken his son? He would not have realized it then, but his life was never going to be the same. Chapter 2. Adoption. Church of San Diego, Bogota, December 1965. Amid the cacophony of cries, one rang out in the darkness. It cut straight through the nuns' hearts, particularly to Sister Frances. She was not quite as old as some of the sisters, but she had been there long enough to have heard it all. The cries of the fractious, the tormented, the downright difficult. As far as the nuns were concerned, every type of child had at one stage passed through the church, but few had heard cries like those of that little boy on his first night in the orphanage. Such was his despair, she and others could only imagine the heartbreak he had suffered. "Shh, little Roberto," Frances said as she soothed him. "Your nightmare is over. You have nothing to fear now." The nuns had no idea what terrors had visited this little boy to make him shriek like that. They could only imagine what he had witnessed. Once calmed by Frances, he again became the cheery, good-natured child he had been when he'd first arrived. It was only while he slept that he became distressed. The nuns had only heard snippets of his story and how he came to be under their care at San Diego. Tales of terrible violence were common, usually confined to criminal vendettas, although the scale of the bloodbath up in the hills prompted a discussion. Was Roberto's mother an innocent victim, caught in the wrong place at the wrong time? The nuns wondered what was happening to their beautiful country, when trauma on this scale was being visited on such a likable tot. And what about the boy's father? Had he been killed there? Why had he not been able to protect the mother or the boy? Did he even know his son was being looked after in the church? Would he come looking for him? Would there be people with guns? Many silent prayers were offered in the wake of such thoughts. Little Roberto was certainly a special case, the nuns thought. He owed his life to the mysterious yet kind gentleman who had handed him into the church. That fact alone was considered to be strange. Usually, when well-to-do people arrived at the orphanage, and others like it across the city, it was to take a child away. Under normal circumstances, babies of Roberto's gender, age, and disposition were in high demand. They didn't even have to be orphans. The nuns had heard stories of children from poor families being sold and even stolen because rich people were willing to hand over so many American dollars for them. Sister Frances bounced the little chap on her knee, and he giggled in response. "You are an angel, little one," she said, smiling. "Don't worry, you will be happy soon." She already knew that her time with him would be brief. He wouldn't be staying with the other orphans for long. All the nuns knew it. From his vantage point, 8 floors up in the imposing Hotel Tequendama, Pat Whitcomb looked down on the Church of San Diego across the street below. "There you go." His wife Joan, fair-haired and elegantly dressed in a tailored primrose blazer, handed him his drink. A large Scotch with ginger ale. He accepted it gratefully. After the day's events, he needed it. She took a sip from her usual, the same whiskey mixed with soda. "Still thinking of the boy?" She followed his gaze to the street below. He nodded. He'd thought of little else since the events of that morning. No collateral damage, Noriega had said. Pat shook his head and sighed. For 6 years now, Pat and his wife had enjoyed the relative luxury of their serviced accommodation within one of Bogota's finest 5-star hotels. Yet during that time, he couldn't escape the feeling that something had been missing. Perhaps that was about to change. "Carlos is here to see you," Joan said, touching his arm before moving towards the door of their lavish apartment. The mood lightened as the jovial figure of Carlos Echeverri came into view. Dressed, as always, in a suit and tie, the likable Echeverri had once been an international statesman, serving as his country's representative to the United Nations and ambassador to Peru, in a career that had not been without controversy. He angered his Peruvian hosts by granting asylum to a political rival of the president, sparking off a military standoff. In person, Carlos seemed too charming and laid back to ruffle feathers, but, as Pat knew, appearances were deceptive, and Carlos had the right blend of charm and steel to make him a real asset in building relations. He had already proved extremely useful, acting as Pat's lawyer and advisor in cultural affairs. "Senor Whitcomb," Carlos beamed, embracing the Englishman. "How are you? A good day, I hear." Pat nodded. "We got the job done." "All the money recovered?" Joan appeared with a drink for the lawyer and left the men to their conversation. "Safely back in the company vaults," Pat said, raising his glass to the lawyer's health. "Mostly all accounted for." "Bravo! So the information was reliable." "Very much so," Pat smiled. "And I hear there was a little complication, no?" Carlos's brow furrowed. Pat looked down again to the church below. "You could say that." "You did an honorable thing, Pat." Carlos clinked his host's glass in appreciation. "Others might have left the little child to his fate." Pat shrugged. He led Carlos over to his desk and showed him the documentation he'd retrieved from the house. The sight of the artifacts that only that morning had belonged to a loving mother brought the images flooding back. He shook them from his mind. It didn't pay to dwell on what had happened. If he allowed them in, those memories of the woman in her red-stained dress could haunt him forever. What's done is done. He couldn't influence the past, but the future he did have a say in. Carlos studied the document. "I understand Don Gregorio has a lot to say about this," he said. Pat nodded. Gregorio Bautista was the entrepreneur whose idea it had been to bring De La Rue's international expertise to Colombia in the first place. He was also Pat's other close ally in this foreign country. "What has he told you?" Echeverri said. Pat leaned against the desk. "He's extremely upbeat about the scenario. When I filled him in on what had happened during the raid, I don't think I've ever seen him happier. He doesn't see the situation involving the orphan boy as a problem. In fact, he called it an unintended consequence, but an opportunity nonetheless. You would almost think that this was meant to be." "What do you mean?" "He could see how troubled I was that we had left a child motherless. The woman was not much older than a child herself. The boy's father is either one of those killed in the house, or he has long since given up claim on the child. Gregorio is using his local contacts to try and establish the father's identity, but he says it's highly unlikely that, even if he were to know the child's whereabouts, he would want to take on such a responsibility. Given that Joan and I have talked about adopting a child because of our situation, he thinks a solution might be right in front of our eyes." "And how do you feel about his suggestion?" Pat glanced over to the window once more, thinking of the church below. "I can see his logic. It could benefit us on many levels. All of us." "Splendid!" Carlos then lowered his tone. "And is that the view shared by everyone?" Pat looked over to where Joan was sitting, in her favourite armchair reading a magazine. She had made her thoughts on the matter very clear. This was too soon to make such decisions. He was too emotional. He should allow time for the dust to settle, and not rush into agreeing something just because Gregorio had suggested it. But Pat knew his own mind, and knew when to trust his own instinct. "Very much so," he said. Carlos looked again over the official document, running his finger over the lines, pausing at the boy's name and that of the mother. He stopped at the third name. Pat followed his finger to the name of the boy's father. "Pablo Escobar," Carlos read aloud. "Is he going to be an issue?" Pat said. He was wondering if this Pablo Escobar was a member of the same family as a man he worked with, Carlos Escobar, a financial expert who had been crucial in helping him set up his commercial enterprise in Colombia. When Pat had seen the name Escobar on what appeared to be the birth certificate, he had immediately thought of his banker friend. Carlos shrugged. "What does the banker say?" "He thinks there might well be a family connection. He's looking into it." "Very well," Carlos said. "And what does Don Gregorio say about the father, if there is a connection, or even if there is not?" Pat hesitated. "He thinks this Pablo Escobar could present us with another opportunity. He thinks Joan and I adopting a Colombian child could be good, not just for our well-being, but in terms of cultural relations. And he thinks if this Escobar is connected to the gangs, it might not be a bad thing for us if he also has this personal connection to our operation." Carlos nodded. "Then leave the paperwork with me," the lawyer said. A few weeks later, a large, black, chauffeur-driven Mercedes pulled up outside the Church of San Diego. Out of it stepped Pat and Joan, accompanied by Carlos Echeverri, and an armed bodyguard. Pat led the way into the church. Since his first visit he had been there many times, keen to check on the progress of the boy. "He is thriving," Father Londono had told him. Pat knew the nuns had taken special care of the boy, and saw that one in particular, Frances, the younger sister, had taken quite a shine to the youngster. This visit was not a social one, however. He was now arriving on business. The party strode in and made straight for Father Londono's office. The priest greeted Pat warmly. He looked pleased to see the Englishman had brought his wife. After a brief exchange of pleasantries, Carlos got down to the matter in hand. He handed over some documents to the priest and handed him a pen. "If you will," he said softly but firmly. Father Londono did not hesitate. Pat suspected this transaction must have ranked as one of the easiest the priest had to handle. He could only imagine the fates that awaited some of the other children. He was sure the church would always pray that their little charges found a happy home, but he suspected those pleas were not always answered. He felt satisfied, however, that in this case the right thing was being done. "Excellent." Carlos said when the formalities were concluded. "Once these documents have been registered with the public records at the notary, everything will be finalized." To Pat and Joan he said, "Congratulations! You are now the parents of a little boy." "Thank you, Carlos," Pat said, exchanging a smile with his wife. Finally, he thought, after their own attempts had been unsuccessful, this was a second chance to start a family after nature, it seemed, had denied them the opportunity to have a baby of their own. In Colombian society, much stock was given to the family unit. A well-to-do couple could only go so far. The presence of a child, especially an adopted son of the soil, could do wonders for their status here. Not to mention that it would bolster his cover story as the boss of an international printing and security firm, while helping to obscure his other line of work, gathering intelligence on criminal gangs. Father Londono nodded. "I have no doubt you will give the boy a happy home." He clasped Pat's hands. "God bless you for what you have done." On 7th of December, 1965, the adoption of Roberto Sendoya Escobar by Patrick and Joan Whitcomb was officially entered in the public records of Bogota, Colombia. With the death of the child's natural mother, a legal guardian had been appointed, a woman named Anita Uribe. Carlos Echeverri took on the role of her legal representative, and it was Anita who was officially tasked with putting the boy up for adoption. It was all as Gregorio, confirmed in the paperwork as the boy's godfather, had said it would be. The boy's name was legally changed to Philip Robert Charles Whitcomb. 4 days later, the Whitcombs returned to the Church of San Diego with their new son Philip, and the child was formally baptized by Father Londono. As was the custom in the staunchly Roman Catholic country, the boy was registered in the Book of Births and Baptisms of the Church, alongside the names of his natural parents, Maria Luisa Sendoya and Pablo Escobar. It was, and remains, the only document in existence to confirm that Robert Sendoya Escobar, now Philip Whitcomb, was the firstborn child of a young man whose name would soon be known the world over. It would be many years before the boy learned of the dramatic circumstances that saw him removed from the loving arms of an impoverished Colombian teenage girl into a world where nothing was as it seemed. After the baptism, the adoptive parents paid a visit to a nearby toy shop to buy their son his first teddy bear. Afterwards, Pat and Joan took him back home, which was now the apartment on the 8th floor of the Tequendama Hotel, across the road from the orphanage. It would be some time before Pablo Escobar found out the truth about what had happened to his son. Escobar, who had just turned 16 on 1st of December, was, at the time of the adoption, living in Envigado, a small village in the shadow of Medellin, nearly 500 miles west from Bogota. His parents were Abel de Jesus Dari Escobar Echeverri, a cattle farmer turned watchman, and Gemilda de los Dolores Gaviria Berrio, a schoolteacher. They were not poor by rural Colombian standards, and certainly educated, yet Pablo, the third of their 7 children, dropped out of school before his 17th birthday. At that age he had 3 passions: football, smoking marijuana, and girls. After losing his virginity to a prostitute at 13, he thought he knew the ways of the world and had tried his luck with several girls, sometimes successfully. But that all changed when he met Maria Luisa Sendoya. Theirs might have been just another fleeting infatuation, but it very soon turned serious. Faced with the persuasive attentions of an older boy who talked a big game, Maria might have found it hard to say no, if she even did give her consent. She would only have been 13, a year below the age of consent in Colombia. But their union was a sign the young Escobar was already unaccustomed to having to wait for the things he wanted. He had already been involved in petty thieving, and the two young teenagers probably didn't pause to think about the legalities of consent. Maria, like many young girls her age, was seduced by the charms of this confident older boy. One can only imagine the shock, confusion and guilt she must have felt when, a few weeks later, she discovered she was pregnant. In a deeply religious country, having a child out of wedlock heaped shame on the entire family of the mother. Abortion, a legal one anyway, was not an option. It was more common for the distraught teenager to be sent away to have her baby, until a plan could be worked out to explain the new arrival. For Maria, that meant spending time at a remote hillside village west of the international airport in Bogota. She may have felt isolated, but, once her son was born, thought the only dangers lay in illness or prying local women asking too many questions. Never could it have entered her head that she and her boy were on a collision course with something as outlandish as foreign intelligence agents working to recover stolen cash from a British banknote company. But it was nonetheless the case that a secret operation begun in London 6 years earlier was destined to have tragic consequences for her, and would change the lives of the son she adored and the boy she'd inadvertently fallen in with from Medellin. Chapter 3. The Assignment. Regent Street, London, December 1959. There was a bite in the air as the tall, smartly suited gent strode down the frosted pavement. He was on one of the capital's iconic shopping streets, but it would still be some time before many of the stores opened their doors. As the man stopped outside the entrance